Did you also receive a call from U.S. Representative Andy Biggs of Arizona on the morning of January 6th?
I did.
And what did Mr. Biggs ask you to do?
I believe that was the day that the vote was occurring to each state to have certification, or to declare the certification of the electors. And he asked if I would sign on both to a letter that had been sent from my state and or that I would support the decertification of the electors. And I said I would not.
Up to his elbows in it, and there may finally be some accountability coming for Trump's allies in Congress who were deeply involved in every facet of trying to overturn Trump's defeat in 2020. According to new reporting in Politico, Congressman Andy Biggs, who we just heard about there, and Congressman Paul Gosar have been subpoenaed by Arizona investigators who are probing the fake electors plot in their state. Those subpoenas ordered the two Republicans to testify before a grand jury. Politico saying this, quote, "There is no indication that Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays, who's leading the probe, is considering bringing criminal charges against either lawmaker. But the subpoenas themselves, in conjunction with a series of other aggressive recent moves, show that Mays, a Democrat, has cast a far wider net in her probe than previously understood." Congressman Biggs was previously subpoenaed by the January 6th Select Committee, but refused to comply with them. Joining our coverage, one of the reporters with this scoop and this great new reporting, Politico national correspondent, MSNBC contributor Betsy Woodruff Swan. Donnie and the Rev are still here. Betsy, take us through what you and your colleagues are reporting.
What we've reported is that in February of this year, Paul Gosar, another very, very conservative Republican who was connected to all the January 6th efforts, communicated to the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, that he had been subpoenaed by Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays. We also have learned from sources that Mays issued a subpoena to Andy Biggs as well. What we don't know is if either of these men have testified to Mays's grand jury or if they've found ways to use the constitutional tools at their disposal to try to fight back against any efforts she may have to get them to testify. What it shows, though, is that Mays, in her investigation, has been willing to take fairly dramatic and aggressive steps as she tries to hoover up as much more information as possible, specifically about the activities in Arizona that perhaps have not yet come to light. Of course, members of Congress were a black box to the January 6th Select Committee. We'll find out whether or not Mays was able to extract more information from them than other investigators have been. What we also know is that Mays's office has communicated to numerous of the fake electors that she's targeting them in her probe. So those people who participated actively in that fake elector scheme have been told there's a decent chance that they will face indictment. What we've also reported is that when some of those folks have communicated to Mays's office that they would plead the fifth if put in front of a grand jury, Mays's office has said, you still have to go. You have to make that pleading in person. And we've also reported that some of those fake electors have already appeared before Mays's grand jury to take the fifth. That, again, is an unusual step for a prosecutor to take. Most prosecutors don't make people plead the fifth in front of a grand jury, but it just shows how aggressive and how frankly, a muscular approach Mays and her team are taking in this investigation, specifically as they target these fake electors. One other thing about Mays that's just really interesting is that she was a Republican until 2019. She said in an interview that she changed parties because of the way that Trumpism had essentially taken over the GOP. She won her election to be Arizona Attorney General by fewer than 400 votes in 2022. It was a total nail biter. And now we're seeing how an extremely tiny vote margin in a very populous and very purple swing state is already having dramatic consequences.
Betsy, let me, you're right that all of the members were a black box to the January 6th Select Committee, but this is what they were able to learn about Congressman Biggs. Representative Biggs was involved in numerous elements of President Trump's efforts to contest the election results. As early as November 6, 2020, Representative Biggs texted Mark Meadows, urging him to, quote, encourage the state legislatures to appoint electors. In the following days, Representative Biggs told Meadows not to let Trump concede his loss. Between then and January 6, Representative Biggs coordinated with Arizona State Representative Mark Finchem to gather signatures from Arizona lawmakers endorsing fake Trump electors. He also contacted fake Trump electors in at least one state seeking evidence related to voter fraud. I mean, I'm wondering if the probe in Michigan or other state probes into the fake electors plots if those are sort of contours we should be watching, and if that is getting at what they're likely to want to ask these two members about.
What's interesting about these state-level probes targeting the fake electors is that they've entered territory that Jack Smith thus far has not entered by accusing these fake electors of crimes. And once that process starts, of course, there are all sorts of avenues that those investigators can look down. What I can also tell you is that Rusty Bowers, who you played footage of just a moment ago, has also spoken with investigators in Chris May's office. Of course, he was famously a totally open book to the Select Committee, but the fact that May's office is speaking to him as well is just another indicator of the very thorough approach that she's taking in this investigation. Biggs and Gosar are just very important for understanding historically what happened on January 6th. They were two of Trump's really important key lieutenants, two of his top House allies at multiple levels of this undertaking. And of course, they're both still prominent national figures. They have some counterparts in Arizona who are not household names, but who potentially could become. Two of the fake electors, Anthony Kern and Jake Hoffman, are now state senators in Arizona. Both of those men are in the space where Mays is considering potentially bringing indictments. One of them, State Senator Kern, actually held a press conference outside of a courthouse in Arizona was just within the last week or two, saying that he thought Chris Mays was trying to put him in prison because he was too supportive of Trump. Of course, these sometimes feel like local stories, especially when you talk about state lawmakers, but they have extraordinary national consequences because Arizona is going to be essential to whoever becomes the next president, almost without a doubt, just looking at the electoral map. And it's a state where the Republican Party has essentially eaten itself by internal fighting over whether or not the Mark Finchem, Andy Biggs, Paul Gosar wing or the John McCain wing is going to win out. At this point, the McCain wing is essentially defunct, and the result has been that Democrats have just galloped over Republicans in a host of statewide races in Arizona with thus far minimal sign of letting up, although, of course, who knows what happens in the fall.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.